A few years ago, I rented an old Victorian house with two of my friends, Sarah and Jake. The house was gorgeous. Huge bay windows, hardwood floors, and intricate crown molding that made it feel like something out of a historical novel. The rent was surprisingly cheap, which should have been a red flag, but we chalked it up to the age of the property. The landlord, a wiry older man named Mr. Lawrence, was friendly enough, though he seemed a little too eager to rent the place. During the walkthrough, he made a point to tell us that the house had been in his family for generations, but he was vague about why he was renting it out. We didn't press him on it. We were too excited about the price. The first few weeks were great. We took turns decorating, throwing small dinner parties, and marveling at how much space we had. But as we settled in, we started noticing odd things about the house. The first thing was the doors. No matter how carefully we closed them, they always seemed to drift open on their own. It wasn't a big deal at first. Old house, uneven floors, right? But it started happening more frequently. We'd wake up to find every door in the house wide open, even ones we were sure we'd locked. Then there were the sounds. Late at night, we'd hear faint creaks and thuds coming from upstairs. The first time it happened, Sarah joked that the house had charming ghost vibes, but Jake wasn't amused. "Old houses settle," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. One night, while we were watching a movie, we heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the attic. Jake paused the movie, and we all stared at the ceiling. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing. "Do we even have an attic?" I asked, trying to mask my nervousness. "Yeah," Jake said. "The landlord mentioned it, but it's sealed off. No stairs, no access." We decided to ignore it, chalking it up to the house's quirks, but the noises continued. A month later, we decided to do some exploring. Jake had found an old floor plan of the house online and noticed something strange. The layout showed a room on the second floor that didn't match up with the actual rooms. It was as if the room had been walled off or forgotten. Curiosity got the better of us, and we spent an entire Saturday searching for clues. Eventually, we found it, a small hidden door behind a built-in bookshelf in the upstairs hallway. The door was so well concealed that we'd completely overlooked it. We pried the door open and found a narrow staircase leading down. The air was cold and smelled like damp wood and dust. None of us wanted to go first, but eventually, Jake grabbed a flashlight and led the way. The staircase opened into a small windowless room. It was empty except for an old wooden chair in the center and a pile of yellowed newspapers in the corner. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper, and the ceiling was low, making the space feel claustrophobic. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, shining her flashlight around. Jake picked up one of the newspapers and frowned. "These are from the 80s, he said, flipping through the brittle pages. "Why would they leave all this down here?" We didn't find anything else, but the discovery left us rattled. Why would someone seal off a room like that? And why was there a chair in the middle of it? We told ourselves it was just a storage room and tried to move on, but things started to get worse. The noises grew louder, more distinct. We'd hear heavy thuds like someone dropping something on the floor, and voices, low, muffled voices that seemed to come from inside the walls. We started finding scratches on the wallpaper near the hidden door, like someone or something had been trying to get out. One night, Sarah came running into my room, pale and shaking. "The chair moved," she said, barely able to get the words out. "I went to check the room, and the chair, it's not in the middle anymore. It's against the wall." Jake decided we needed answers, so we called Mr. Lawrence. When we asked him about the room, there was a long pause. "I told you not to mess with that door," he said, his voice tight. "You didn't tell us anything about it," Jake shot back. "What's going on?" Mr. Lawrence sighed. "That room, it's part of the house's history. My grandfather used to lock people in there. Debt collectors, rivals, anyone who crossed him. The chair, it was his way of making them uncomfortable. No windows, no light. Just waiting. Why didn't you tell us?" I demanded. "I didn't think you'd find it," he admitted. "No one's lived there long enough to notice." We moved out within a week. I don't know if the noises, the scratches, or the voices were real, or if we just let our imaginations run wild. But I do know one thing. That room wasn't meant to be found, and whatever had happened in that house, whatever had been done in that room, it hadn't been forgotten. Not by the house, and not by the ghosts of its past. About 3 years ago, I was fresh out of a bad breakup and looking for a place to start over. I didn't have much money, so when I found a cozy one-bedroom apartment listed for well below market rent, I jumped on it. The landlord, a man named Greg, seemed friendly during the walkthrough. He was in his late 40s, clean-cut, and very chatty, telling me how he liked to keep things personal with his tenants. At first, it seemed like a decent setup. The apartment was small but clean, and Greg lived just a few blocks away. He'd stop by once in a while to check in, which I assumed was normal. But as the weeks went on, his visits started to feel less casual and more intrusive. It started with little things. Greg would pop by unannounced, always with some flimsy excuse. He needed to check the pipes, make sure the smoke detectors worked, or inspect the windows. It got to the point where I began dreading the sound of his knock. I tried to brush it off, telling myself he was just a hands-on landlord. But then he started calling me at odd hours. "Hey," he'd say late at night, "I noticed your porch light's been on for a while. Everything okay?" Or, "Just wanted to make sure you're settling in all right." At first, I'd politely thank him for checking in, but the calls became more frequent, and the undertone in his voice made me uneasy. It wasn't concern. It was possessiveness. One night, I came home from work to find a bouquet of flowers on my doorstep with a note. "You're the best tenant I've ever had. Hope these brighten your day. Greg." It was strange, but I told myself he was just being nice. I thanked him via text, thinking that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next few weeks, Greg's behavior escalated. He started leaving gifts on my porch. A box of chocolates, a small plant, even a framed photo of a beach with a handwritten note that said, "Thought this might help you relax." I didn't know how to respond. I started avoiding him, letting his calls go to voicemail and making excuses when he knocked on the door. Then one evening, I came home to find him sitting on my front steps. "Hey," he said with a broad smile, standing up as I approached. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd say hi. I tried to keep my voice light. "Oh, hi. I just got back from work. It's been a long day." "That's why I'm here," he said. "I figured you might like some company." I froze. His tone was friendly, but there was something off about the way he said it. It felt less like an offer and more like an expectation. "Thanks, but I'm really tired," I said, fumbling with my keys. "I think I'm just going to call it a night." His smile faltered, and for a moment his eyes darkened. "All right," he said slowly. "But if you ever need anything, you know where to find me." I nodded quickly, closed the door behind me, and locked it. My heart was racing. I told myself I'd confront him if it happened again, but deep down, I wasn't sure I had the nerve. The final straw came a week later. I'd just gotten out of the shower when I heard a noise in the hallway. It sounded like the faint creak of a floorboard. My stomach dropped. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, my wet hair sticking to the back of my neck. The door to my bedroom was slightly ajar, and when I peeked through the crack, my blood ran cold. Greg was standing in my living room. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He was looking around, running his hand along the edge of my couch, as if he owned the place. I must have made a noise because he suddenly turned toward my bedroom door. "Hello?" he called out, his voice calm, almost casual. I backed away, my heart pounding. I dialed 911 and whispered to the operator that someone had broken into my apartment. Greg was still in the living room, muttering something to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling. Minutes later, I heard sirens. Greg must have heard them too, because he bolted for the door. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. I explained everything to the officers, showing them the gifts he'd left and recounting his increasingly erratic behavior. The next day, I started packing. I found another place to live, filed a restraining order, and never went back to that apartment. Months later, I heard from a former neighbor that Greg had been arrested for breaking into another tenant's apartment. Apparently, he'd been doing it for years, using his master key to snoop on tenants and in some cases steal small personal items. The thought of him wandering through my home, going through my things, possibly even watching me while I slept, still haunts me. I've learned to trust my gut and never ignore red flags, no matter how small. Sometimes the people who seem the most helpful are the ones you should fear the most. A couple of years ago, I had just landed my first full-time job out of college, and I was desperate to find a place to live. The city I moved to was notoriously expensive, and my entry-level salary wasn't going to cover a one-bedroom apartment. After scouring every rental site I could think of, I ended up on Craigslist, which is how I met Aaron. Aaron's ad was simple. He was looking for a roommate to share a two-bedroom apartment. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the location was perfect. Walking distance from work and in a relatively safe neighborhood. I emailed him, and he responded almost immediately. He said he was a grad student who kept to himself and worked odd hours, so I'd basically have the place to myself. It sounded ideal. We met at a coffee shop to go over details, and he seemed nice enough. He was in his late 20s, clean-cut and soft-spoken. He showed me photos of the apartment, and it looked great. We agreed I'd move in the following weekend. For the first couple of weeks, everything was fine. Aaron was quiet, almost too quiet. He spent most of his time in his room, and I rarely saw him. At first, I thought it was perfect. I had my space, and he had his. But then I started noticing things. It began with the little stuff. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and come back to find them on the table. The bathroom door, which I always left slightly ajar, would be shut when I came home. My TV remote would go missing, only to turn up in weird places like under the couch or in the bathroom. At first, I figured I was just forgetful, or maybe Aaron was absent-mindedly moving things around. But one night, I came home late from work and noticed something that made my stomach turn. My bedroom door, which I always locked when I left, was slightly open. I knew for a fact I had locked it before leaving that morning. I stepped inside, and everything seemed normal, at least until I noticed my laptop was open. I always shut it down before I leave. When I checked the browser history, I found several searches I hadn't made. They weren't anything overtly creepy, just random Google searches about my workplace and social media accounts. It was enough to freak me out. The next morning, I confronted Aaron. I asked if he'd been in my room or used my laptop. He denied everything, looking genuinely offended that I'd even suggested. "Why would I do that?" he said. "I don't care about your stuff." I wanted to believe him, but the unease didn't go away. A few nights later, I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought Aaron was just going to the bathroom, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept pacing back and forth outside my room. I stayed in bed, frozen, listening as the footsteps paused right outside my door. Then I heard the doorknob jiggle. I grabbed my phone and whispered, "Aaron?" The footsteps stopped. There was silence for a moment, and then I heard his bedroom door close softly. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I bought a small camera and hid it on my bookshelf, pointing toward the door. I needed to know if I was just imagining things or if something was really going on. It didn't take long to get my answer. 2 days later, I came home from work and checked the camera footage. What I saw made my blood run cold. Around 2 a.m., Aaron had come into my room. He didn't turn on the lights. He just stood there, staring at my bed. After a few minutes, he walked over to my desk, opened the drawers, and started going through my things. He even sat down at my desk and opened my laptop, typing something I couldn't make out on the screen. The worst part? He stood by my bed for almost 10 minutes before leaving. I packed my things that night and slept at a friend's house. The next day, I called the police and showed them the footage. They said it wasn't enough to arrest him, but advised me to file a report and find a new place to live. When I went back to get the rest of my stuff, Aaron acted like nothing had happened. He even asked why I was leaving so suddenly. I didn't answer. I just left. A few months later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Aaron had been evicted. Apparently, he'd pulled the same creepy behavior with another roommate, who also moved out after a few weeks. I have no idea what his deal was, but I'm just glad I got out when I did. If you're ever desperate enough to look for housing on Craigslist, please be careful. Some people seem normal until they're not. A few years ago, I decided to post a roommate ad on Craigslist. I'd been renting a 2-bedroom apartment by myself, and the cost was starting to become unmanageable. I thought having a roommate would ease the financial burden. It seemed like a simple enough solution, but looking back now, I wish I'd just found a second job instead. The ad was straightforward. I described the apartment, the rent, and a bit about myself. Within a day, I received a handful of replies. Most were from people who seemed normal enough, but one stood out. His name was Alex, and he wrote an enthusiastic email about how he'd just moved to the city, worked as a graphic designer, and was looking for a quiet place to live. He even attached a link to his portfolio, which looked legitimate. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop near the apartment to talk things over. Alex seemed nice in person, soft-spoken, polite, maybe a little awkward, but not in a creepy way. He said all the right things. He didn't party, he was clean, and he worked long hours, so I probably wouldn't see much of him. It sounded perfect. After a short chat, I offered him the room, and he agreed to move in that weekend. At first, everything was fine. Alex kept to himself, just like he said he would. He'd leave for work early in the morning and come back late at night. I'd hear him typing away in his room, or occasionally see him cooking in the kitchen. We didn't talk much, but that was fine by me. I wasn't looking to make a new best friend, just someone to split the rent with. About a month in, I started noticing some weird behavior. It started small, like how he'd always lock his bedroom door, even when he was home. I figured he was just private, so I didn't think much of it. Then I noticed how he never brought anyone over. No friends, no coworkers, nothing. Again, Not a big deal, but it added to the growing list of quirks. Then things got stranger. One night, I came home from work to find Alex sitting in the dark in the living room. The only light came from the TV, which was playing static. He didn't say anything when I walked in, just sat there, staring at the screen. When I asked if he was okay, he mumbled something about having a bad day and got up to go to his room. After that, I started locking my bedroom door at night. About a week later, I noticed things in my room had been moved. A picture frame on my dresser was tilted, my closet door was open a crack, and my laptop, which I always left on my desk, was on my bed. At first, I thought maybe I was just being forgetful. But the feeling that something was off wouldn't go away. I decided to test a theory. Before leaving for work the next morning, I set a small piece of tape on the edge of my bedroom door, just barely hanging onto the frame. When I came home that night, the tape was on the floor. Someone had been in my room. That night, I confronted Alex. I knocked on his door, and after a long pause, he opened it just enough to look out. His room was dark, and I couldn't see much past him, but what I did see was odd. Piles of clothes on the floor, papers scattered everywhere, and what looked like a stack of empty food containers. "Hey," I said, trying to sound calm. "Have you been in my room?" He blinked at me, his face expressionless. "No," he said flatly. "I'm serious," I pressed. "I know someone's been in there." His expression didn't change. "It wasn't me," he said, then closed the door in my face. I should have kicked him out then and there, but I didn't. I wasn't sure if I could legally evict him without more proof, and I wasn't ready to deal with the hassle of finding another roommate. I told myself I'd keep my door locked and wait it out until the end of the lease. That weekend, I came home late after hanging out with some friends. As I walked up the stairs to my apartment, I noticed the lights were off, which was strange because Alex was almost always home. When I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the smell hit me immediately. A mix of garbage, sweat, and something else I couldn't place. I flipped on the lights and froze. The apartment was trashed. Furniture was overturned, cabinets were open, and there was trash scattered everywhere. My bedroom door was wide open, and when I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. My clothes had been pulled out of the closet and dumped on the floor. My bed was stripped of its sheets, and my laptop was gone. Panicking, I ran to Alex's room and threw open the door. It was empty, completely empty. The clothes, the papers, the food containers, everything was gone. It was as if he'd never lived there. I called the police, and when they arrived, they searched the apartment but didn't find much. The only clue they had was the building's security footage, which showed Alex leaving earlier that evening with 2 large duffel bags. He never came back. A few days later, I got a call from one of the detectives handling the case. He told me they'd identified Alex, or rather, the man who called himself Alex. His real name wasn't Alex, and he wasn't a graphic designer. He was a drifter with a long history of squatting in rentals and stealing from his roommates before disappearing. To this day, I have no idea what he was doing in my room or why he left so suddenly. The thought of him going through my things, knowing every detail of my life, still makes my skin crawl. Now I'd rather work 3 jobs than ever risk living with a stranger again.